What's your opinion on going to Kollel versus immediately going into Parnasa?
I'm not hearing that. I'm opinion on what?
Going into Kollel versus going straight into Parnasa.
Other things being equal, the longer you learn, the better off you are.
If it's like, if it's not so much of a struggle for the Parnasa.
Other things being equal, the longer you learn, the better off you are. Question is, what costs do you incur? Lose opportunities? I don't know, but I'm just saying, learning is a very important value, and if you're not going to lose anything thereby, then stay in learning as long as you can.
Would you say that objectively, usually it's more likely there's less risks at the beginning of marriage than much later? Less responsibilities, and like you're less likely to learn later than at the beginning?
Much less likely. 100%, much less likely. Because you have responsibilities for Parnasa for the vast majority of men, and you have children, and it doesn't stop when the children grow up, because they have grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and then it's not just a question of money, it's a question of advice and support and help when things are needed. And it's wonderful. The bigger your family, it's a great privilege and it's a great joy, but it's also a great responsibility. So it does happen, but it's much harder than at the beginning. Furthermore, especially at the beginning of a marriage, it sets a certain tone to the marriage. Somebody asks your wife, "What's your husband do?" "He's learning." Oh, that's the foundation on which the house is being built. My husband's learning. So, 10 years from now, it'll be when he's out at 8 o'clock in the evening, my husband's at a shiur. But it'll be said with the same, my husband's learning. And that's the point of pride. Pride for the wife, pride for the children. Our father learns. Yeah, he works, but he learns. And that's such a different context for the.
Safe to expect Parnasa to come.
No, to ignore the economic realities, no. But for example, Rav Mendel used to talk about this. An intelligent, focused, hardworking guy can learn a technical skill without college background in 2 years for sure, maybe less. He'll learn the math, he'll learn the law, he'll pick it up. Especially if he's been learning. Used to 12-hour days, and used to working on Gemaras and so forth and so on. Won't be hard. Now, why should he do it from 18 to 20 when he can do it from 24 to 26? Why should he do it early? Why not spend that time laying your Torah foundation? You get married, you have a couple of kids, money's becoming difficult, and you figure, okay, it's going to take me a year and a half, 2 years to nail this. By the time I'm 26, we're going to need a steady income. So at 24, you go into it. Meantime, you spent, since 18, graduating high school, till 24, 6 solid years learning. They talk about all the preparatory skills you need. They're all the preparatory skills that a person who's not interested in reading and doesn't have a good attention span and doesn't interested in studying anything, would much rather go to football games, all the preparatory skills he needs at age 9 in order to be a success in life. But it doesn't mean you need them. The average person coming from a Torah household doesn't need them. He doesn't grow up in that context, in that environment, that set of values. I remember when I was in high school, a friend of mine had a car, and he used to drive around with nothing to do. What is there to do? No Torah kid does that. There's plenty to do. Learn Mishnayos, Go hear a shiur. There's always something to do. Okay. So I will talk about this. That's the advertised shiur. Interpretation. Are there objective standards of interpretation? Well, anywhere outside of our circles, the popular answer today is no. Not only no, but of course not. A text sits there. It doesn't mean anything by itself. You read it, and you relate to it in your way. And that's your genuine way of relating to it. And no one's to tell you that something wrong with your way of relating to the text. You're a person, you read it, and this is how you reacted to it. Other people react in other ways, relate to it in other ways. Nothing makes your way of relating to it any better or worse than anybody else's way of relating to it. So, of course, and no objective standards. Number one. Number two, don't the classical commentators disagree as to what the text means? So, they disagree with what it means, and they're all competent, they're all trustworthy, they're all authorities, then obviously there aren't objective standards. Now watch how I change the vocabulary. You should always be careful when someone changes the vocabulary. Of course there aren't objective standards to determine what the text means, because they disagree. But I didn't use those words before, to determine what the text means. Whenever somebody changes the vocabulary, you should be suspicious. Especially when you're discussing a certain subject and the person asks a question, and in his question there's vocabulary that hasn't been used in presenting the subject. Right away, you should be suspicious. He's changing the subject. Not consciously, but unconsciously. He's interpreting in his own mind and he's changing the subject, and you have to be careful of that. Now, I have a suggestion to make in general about philosophy. Philosophy talks about lots of abstract, general things which are very exciting and seem to be earth-shattering, but also they're not very common, not part of your everyday thought patterns or questions that you deal with. Take the subject, the philosophical subject, and try to apply it to some very simple, everyday, trivial examples. Examples where you feel you understand the example well, and see how the philosophical subject works out with respect to those examples. I think when you do that, if you get into the habit of doing that, you'll discover often enough that you get one of two surprises. Either it doesn't apply the way you thought, it doesn't give you the conclusions that you thought you would get, or, in a certain sense, even worse, you can't figure out how it applies at all. You just can't connect the philosophical subject with the simple example. And when you have that experience, you think to yourself, did I know what I was talking about? Did I have any clue what it really meant? And often the answer is no. You didn't know what you were talking about. So, here we're talking about interpreting texts. Let me give you a couple of absolutely trivial examples and see how you feel about them. Peter and Paul have signed a contract, and in it says every 15th of the month, Peter will deliver to Paul $10,000 in cash. $10,000 US in cash. And indeed, the 15th of every month, Peter shows up in Paul's office with a box, and in the box there's $10,000 in cash. Until August. August 15th, Peter walks into Paul's office on the 15th, hands him the box, Paul opens the box, and the box is filled with 10,000 Monopoly dollars. Paul says, is today your April Fool's Day or something? You're making a joke? No. Look, the contract says $10,000. Count them. There's $10,000 in there. No, what do you mean real dollars? And he says, they are real Monopoly dollars. They're real Monopoly. I'm not that fake. They're not counterfeit. They're real Monopoly dollars. So he says, well, you're crazy. So he says, where did you write in the contract no Monopoly dollars? Did you write that in the contract? Did you put those words in the contract? No? That's how I interpret it. I interpret it as allowing Monopoly dollars. So Paul says, look, it says US dollars. And Peter says, look at the box, Paul. Monopoly set, made in USA. These are United States Monopoly dollars. You got it. That's exactly what it is. And now, who's right here, boys and girls? Is this a difficult situation? Does Peter have a case that he's fulfilled the contract by giving Monopoly dollars? If not, why not? If anyone can interpret a text any way he feels, no one can say whose interpretation is more genuine Why is it that Peter is not fulfilling his obligation? Yeah.
People, I think actually it's perfectly fine to assume whose interpretation is actually more genuine or not. It'd be safe to assume that this was clearly a not so genuine interpretation. From the get-go, he knows he's supposed to be using legal tender. And he'll find every reason that's obviously not within the book to fit within the specific book.
Well, then there must be some objective rules for interpretation, because you're disqualifying his interpretation. You're saying it's not accurate. You can only do that if there's some objective rules. That's the definition of objectivity, by the way. One of the definitions is that some opinions are wrong. That's what makes the subject an objective subject. Otherwise, everyone's opinion is as good as anybody else's.
Exactly.
And this, by the way, is the answer to one of the objections that we raised before. It said, well, aren't there disagreements about what the text means? Yes, there are. But there's agreement that 150 alternatives are wrong. On that, there's agreement. There may be 3 that they disagree about, whether they're right or wrong, but there are many, many others in which everyone will agree is wrong. You don't have to have, this is when I changed the vocabulary, the use of objective rules need not be tied to giving you a unique result. You have objective rules when they can rule some alternatives out. That already makes it objective. Maybe they're not specific enough to determine one particular unique answer, but if they can rule others out, then it's objective. Here's another example. I don't know how they call it today, but boy and a girl are connected to one another, and then boy gets a letter from the girl. We used to call it a Dear John letter. Essentially what it says is, Dear John, I hope I never see you again as long as I live. Right? So he's in despair, and he's suffering, and so forth and so on. And his friend Peter comes and says, what's wrong, John? What's bothering you? Oh, look at this letter that my girlfriend wrote to me, and my life is ruined, and so forth and so on. So Peter looks at it and says, John, you're just not interpreting it right. Is it? Dear John, I never means I never go with an hour without missing you, and I hope to see you as soon as possible. My wants are insatiable. I want to be with you all the time. Ever again. I don't want us to be parted ever again. We should be together forever. That's what it really means. That's the interpretation. Interpret it that way, you'll be much happier. Now, if John is not, hopelessly lost, he'll say, but that's not what it means. And that's not what she means. If I take that and buy a bouquet of flowers and go over to her house, she'll slam the door in my face, because that's what it means. It means she doesn't want to see me again. That's what it means. So is somebody going to say, no, there's a mistake here, and Peter's interpretation of the letter is just as good as John's, and the guy can deliver monopoly dollars? I hope not. So if that's true, then it can't be just free play. It can't be just up for grabs. Now, one of the ways that people try to work this as a game to convince you that there are at least a wide variety of completely unintended interpretations which are equally valid is to use the trick that I mentioned about 5 minutes ago. And that is, we said, where does it say in the contract no monopoly dollars? Let me explain to you what criterion is being used here. Criterion is anything that's consistent with the text is acceptable interpretation. All it needs to be is that the text doesn't rule it out. So, Macbeth is a play by Shakespeare, when Macbeth is the chief character of the play, and somebody says, I interpret Macbeth as a transvestite. You do? Really? Whew. Why do you do that? And the person says, because Shakespeare didn't write, and Macbeth is not a transvestite. He didn't write that in the play. So it's consistent. What I'm saying is consistent. Not every account of a subject that's consistent with the evidence is appropriate. Do you also believe in conspiracy theories? Conspiracy theories always describe an alternative that's possible. They're ruled out by something in the evidence. That doesn't make it as good a candidate for the truth as anything else. Conspiracy theories are very carefully crafted so that they give you a scenario which nothing in what you know about the evidence can contradict. Still, you think they're nuts. And they are nuts for various reasons. So being consistent isn't good enough. It's not enough that nothing in the text contradicts you. It's rather that there has to be positive evidence in the text that supports you. You have to point to something and say, see that? That says I'm right. Not just, there's nothing that says I'm wrong. That's not good enough. So, the responsibility is not just to avoid contradiction. The responsibility is to find positive support in the text for what you're saying. Now, someone will say, but look, Rabbi, different texts have different uses. And because they have different uses, they have different standards that apply to them. So there's no one royal road here. There can't be one set of rules that's the objective rules for doing interpretation. Interpretation is relative to context, relative to purpose. That's 100% correct. Interpretation is relative to context, relative to purpose, like lots of other things are. But when something's relative, that doesn't mean there's no truth or falsity about it, no correct or incorrect about it. When something's relative, what it means is, in order to get to what you need to evaluate, you have to fill in what it's relative to. Once you fill it in, it becomes a matter of fact and truth like everything else. Let me give you an example, because it's very abstract. It's important about a point about relativism. Which is the correct side of the road to drive on, right or left?
Subjective.
Jose?
So it's subjective.
It's subjective, you say? Objective? Well, I can't hear the word.
Subjective.
Subjective?
Yeah.
Certainly not subjective.
No.
One might say it's relative.
Subjective to the... okay.
I mean, what you meant was relative,
Wrong
right?
word for me.
So it's relative, you know. In New York, it's the right side, and in London, it's the left side. Okay. It's relative to geography. So put in the relativity. Ask, what is the correct side of the street to drive on in New York? Now there's only one answer. It doesn't depend on how you feel about it. It's not a question of how it strikes you. The correct answer in New York is the right side. The correct answer in London is the left side. Those are the only correct answers, period. Sof pasuk, end of story. So, if you tell me that books, literature, is relative to context, that's true. But when you know what the purpose of the particular work is, you know the context in which it's being created, then you know what standards to use. For example, if you have a history book or an encyclopedia, you want every sentence in the book to be true, because its job is to record facts of various kinds. Suppose I have a novel. I expect almost all the sentences in the book to be false. There never were such people. Nobody ever said those words. Nobody ever did those actions. But I expect it to be meaningful, give insight. The scenario should be plausibly put together, even though it may not be common, plausibly put together, so the psychology works. Otherwise, it's trash. So it's not as if when I'm not doing history, there are no standards. It's just there are different standards. And everybody knows that a novel gets one set of standards, and history and biography get another set of standards, and poetry gets another set of standards. And you know what the standards are, and when you apply them, those standards determine what is an appropriate interpretation of the work in question. So again, there's no conclusion like it's up to you, and it's no question of how it makes you feel and so forth and so on. It's simply not correct. Let me give you. You have a question?
Yeah, you're probably gonna get to it at some point in the shiur, but would you be able to say like when you're going to? Okay, now I'm going to list the objectives.
But again, it's going to.
Like
what I just said now was that it depends upon the context. I will make a list of some of them for a particular context, But no,
it's good for like just to have as like.
no, but I don't know if you're hearing me. You sound like you're on a different arutz, a different station. I just said that the rules for interpreting depend upon the context, and you may have no rules that apply in all the contexts. So you can't have it in your pocket, just pull it out when you need it, because in different contexts there'll be different rules. How about the sentences in the book should be true? In some contexts, that's an important rule. In some contexts, it's totally useless. In poetry, it's useless.
Yeah.
Right? In literature, it's often useless. Nobody said those words. Nobody lived in those places. There was no town with that name. They're all false sentences. So what?
Like
the literature is in business of describing objective facts about the common world. So you can't. It's not as if you can have a set of rules. Aristotle made this point about logic. Every subject has its own logic. There's no useful set of rules that will apply across the board to all subjects.
There's a way of thinking that will apply across the board.
No.
To find those specific ways of logic.
No. Let's put it this way: there are some things that work across the board, but they're so thin and so few because the thin subjects change so much. Right? What's the method of discovering the truth about the world? Make observations, do experiments, think up a theory, make a prediction, test and see whether the prediction is true or not, and change it if the prediction isn't true. That's the scientific method. That's how you discover the truth about the world, right? That's my method. That's my method across the board. Except in mathematics, where it doesn't work. There are no observations, and no experiments, no theories, and no predictions. Nothing. Mathematics is not true. Mathematics is not important. Mathematics is not objective. Yeah, it is. It's just a different method, right? So, history. There are no experiments in history. There are no predictions in history, and so on and so on. I mean, history is nothing. It has a different methodology. So you can't have these universal things. Don't contradict yourself. That's useful, I think, across the board. Don't contradict yourself. But that's too thin to do a lot of work in any particular case. So I say no. You're not going to get a set of rules that works across the board. It's not going to happen. So now I'll give you an example from another area which is treated the same way. Let's say music. Music has to be interpreted. And different artists create different ways, right? Then there are music critics. Music critics. There's a performance. Next day, the newspaper, there's a column written by a music critic who evaluates the performance. What? He evaluates the performance? What's he doing? He's just saying how he felt about it. That's how he felt about it. Maybe if I went, I would feel differently about it. What do you mean he's evaluating the performance? Well, the answer is because the music was composed by the composer, and it's part of a tradition of music where it's supposed to express something. It's supposed to say something. And if you study music and you listen to hundreds of hours of music, you pick up on things that the average person won't pick up on. And you know the literature to the extent that you know something about what it's supposed to be doing. And there can be new interpretations. That happens all the time. But interpretations have to hang together. And if that sounds mystical and prejudiced to you, think of the parallel with language. And by the way, when we talk about interpreting text is a little misleading. Every time you speak, you're speaking a text. It's just words. Right? Here's a famous line from Shakespeare. To be or not to be is the question. But of course, if any actor said it that way, you'd shoot him. That's not expressing Shakespeare. That's when we had the recorded messages, right? And then each number was recorded a different voice. And when you got the telephone number, the voices were different pitch, like 2, 6, 4, 9, L. And it's not as if there's only one way to say it. Yeah, maybe a dozen ways to say it. But there are 1,000 ways not to say it. And that means that it's got to hang together and communicate something. So not every interpretation of those words is an equally appropriate interpretation to express what's meant to be expressed. For example, one thing you want to know about a line in a play is how important is the line. that'll determine, usually, how quickly it's spoken. You give special emphasis when you speak slowly. It catches attention, holds the attention. So, usually, there are exceptions, but usually, the slower you speak it, the more important the message is. If you don't understand that to be or not to be, that is the question. It's an important message. And you just toss it off. To be or not to be is the question. Please pass the coffee. You've missed it. That's no way to express it. And it's not an interpretation. It's just a mistake. So that's true in music. It's certainly true in text as well. Now, when you look at our texts, let's say the Chumash, here you face a very difficult problem because this one text plays a number of different roles simultaneously. It's part of different contexts at the same time. So this text will have different rules applied to it, leading to different interpretations, but here the different interpretations aren't in competition with one another. Each interpretation is an analysis of the text from the point of view of a particular context, a particular goal, particular use, and it can have a different interpretation for each use, and all the interpretations are correct. For example, I'll take a very simple example. The Mishnayos, when you ask about a Mishnah, why it's written the way it's written, sometimes the answer you get is, the purpose of the Mishnah was to be a text that will be memorized. And to memorize is easier if things are structured. If they have continuity, they're balanced. And sometimes pieces are put in just for balance, just to make it easier to memorize. So don't read any extra legal implication to it. It's not in the legal dimension that this piece of text is functioning. It's in the use of it being memorized context. That's where it functions. So, and everything, all things that are being said are correct. They're just coming from different dimensions. So when there's a disagreement about what the text means, so here I want to make two remarks. First of all, you can't just take it for granted that there's a disagreement. If one commentator says the text means A, and in the other commentator the text means B, it might mean both. Even if there are different interpretations, it might mean both. The author, capital A, may have intended that this text indicate both interpretations in the same dimension. And even if the interpretations are contradictory, it'll be a mistake to ask, well, which one is right? Which one is the right interpretation? Because it may be the text wants you to confront the contradiction. The purpose of the text is to raise the contradiction in your mind to make you think about it. Maybe later on in the text, something will be done to explain it more. So in that case, both interpretations are correct, and neither is exclusive. So when do you know that you have a contradiction in interpretation? When one commentator will say, the other commentator is wrong, this is what it means. And that does happen. In that case, you definitely have a disagreement about what the text should mean. But it's more rare than just finding differences of interpretation. Now, one more remark to make about interpretation, then I'll give you a few examples. There are at least two different kinds of interpretation. One I would call deduction, and the other is explanation. Sometimes, more rarely, you can prove from the text that it means Q. Again, maybe and RS and T also, but it means Q at least. You can prove that it means Q, and that no competitor to Q, no interpretation that rules Q out, that contradicts Q, is going to be correct. Sometimes you can do that. More often, what you can do is this. The text has certain features. Sometimes they're problematic, they're hard to understand. And you create a scenario, what you could call a theory, to explain why the text has those features. And again, it's not just that the explanation is consistent with the text. No, there's actual support in the text for that interpretation. But when you have a theory that explains something, that never rules out other theories. Science is full of that. They had very convincing theories, and then after 100 years, somebody thought up another theory that also explained it from a different point of view. So, explanation is looser. It allows another contradictory interpretation to exist and to be neither one to be ruled out. So someone may say, well, if it does that, what is it doing? What is it accomplishing? And to answer that question, I would just have you meditate on the comparison with science. No scientific theory, strictly speaking, rules out the possibility of another theory. Do you think science is not doing anything? Not accomplishing anything? Not getting at anything true? Probably you don't feel that way. So you shouldn't just dismiss explanations as of no value. There's less value in terms of interpreting than a deduction, but the usefulness of it is not compromised thereby. So now, it says in the book of Genesis, Jacob had a dream. And the first part of the dream, just a few words, is that Hine Sula Mutzav Arza V'Rosha Magia Hashemayma. And a ladder, in the dream he sees a ladder stretched out earthward to the earth, and its top reaches heavenward to the heavens. Now suppose I offer the following interpretation. I say, the ladder is stretched out earthward. It's going to the earth. Where's it coming from? Well, the only other place in the context is the heavens. So presumably it's coming from the heavens to the earth. And that teaches an important lesson. Connections between heaven and earth are made by heaven reaching to earth. Not like the famous painting of man on one side and God on the other, and each one reaching out and their fingers coming to it. No. The message of that verse is connections of heaven and earth are made by heaven reaching down to earth. That's the interpretation. Now the critic says, Rabbi, you have a very short attention span. You're reading about 3 words. How about doing the other half of the sentence, which is just another 3 words? What about the top reaches heavenward, to the heavens? If you're going to use the phrase to the earth to mean coming from heaven to earth, why don't you use to the heavens at the end of the verse to mean going from earth to heaven? And if then you're going to have a contradiction, then face it and give up the whole project, as the Gemara says very often. Reisha kacha, seifa kacha. You can't draw an analogy because one half goes one way, the other goes the other way, and you have no way to determine what you should be doing. Why are you favoring earthward and ignoring heavenward? Says the critic. There's an answer, because the other phrases in the 2 halves of the sentence are not parallel. In the first half of the sentence, the object you're talking about is the ladder. In the second half of the sentence, the object you're talking about is the top of the ladder. A piece, an end. In the first half, the verb is stretched out. In the second half, it's reaches. The first half of the verse describes how the ladder gets put into position. And there it's fair to say it got put into position by moving earthward. That means it's coming from heaven. So it's set up by going from heaven to earth. But the second half doesn't describe how it got put into place. The second half just describes how far it reaches. Magia is where it reaches to. Where does it get to? That's just a question of where the other end is. It's like you come to a fork in the road and you ask a local resident, the right-hand turn, how far does it go? You don't mean they're laying down the tar out in the miles from here. You want to know how much further they're going to lay down the tar. You want to know where the other end is. Nothing's going anywhere. You just want to know where the other end is. Like the guy who was in Maine, and a visitor asked the local, "How do you get to such and such a place?" And the guy from Maine thinks about it for a minute, and he says, "You can't get there from here." There's just no connection. You just can't get there from here. So, the two halves of the sentence are not parallel, and I claim that the first half, where you deduce that the ladder was put into place by coming from heaven to earth, and it carries the message that connections are made from heaven to earth, I claim that's a deduction. Now, I said this for many years, and I said it with the qualification that it's just my own thought, that's the way it seems to me. But Rav Hirsch actually says this word for word. So now I know that I don't have to apologize for it. This is a deduction. Nothing you say, stand on your head, spit wooden nickels, is not going to help you. Nothing's going to contradict the fact that this is how the connection is made from heaven to earth. There are lots of other things that could be there, but this is not going to be dislodged. This is written in the words. Now, here, someone says, Rabbi, you misunderstand. It's all symbolic. It's all symbolic. Heaven means your highest ideals, and earth means the physical means at your disposal, and one informs the other, and so forth and so on. You're just making a completely wrong understanding of what it's about. Here, I will say to the person, you're misunderstanding the levels of interpretation. You agree with me as to what the words mean. What you disagree with me about is what their moral is. You too agree that whatever is heaven in the sentence and whatever earth is in the sentence, the latter is a connection between the two of them, and it's the heaven thing that makes the connection to the earth thing. That you agree with me. That's what the words say. You can't escape that. You just think the moral is between morals, your ideals, and your physical circumstances. And I think it has to do with theology. But you're not disagreeing with what the words mean. The point of the words that I'm making is that the connection between the heaven and the earth is made by the heaven reaching out to earth and making the connection. And you're not denying that. If you deny that, things go the other opposite way, or there's no commitment to the verse to it, then you're wrong, because that's what the verse says. Now, that's a deduction. The next half of the verse says, agents of God, malachim in Hebrew is best translated as agents. Agents of God are going up and down on the ladder. Up and down on the ladder. Why are they doing that? And why is it up and down, let's say, rather than down and up? If these agents of God are what we call angels, you expect their home base to be in the heavens. And if it's a round trip, then you'd expect it to say down and up, not up and down. And the commentators actually asked this question. Now, here's an explanation. Jacob, when he's having this dream, this is really in the text, Jacob, when he's having this dream, is on his way to leaving the land of Israel. And this dream is about his future. For him, leaving the land of Israel is a jolt. It's something which is a shock to him, and a worry. It causes a certain amount of worry. And he's dreaming about that period of time that he's going to spend outside the land of Israel. And the angels on the ladder are what God accompanies him with as he lives. And there are two types of accompaniments, the Israeli accompaniments and the externals. And they're not the same. And what he's seeing in the dream is a changing of the guard. That the Israeli angels are leaving him, going up the ladder, and they'll be replaced by the externals coming down the ladder. That's what this is interpreted as. And you say, but Rabbi, he's just making it up. Could be anything else also. He's just saying that. Yeah. But look, 20 years later when he comes back, Jacob, coming to the land of Israel, he meets a camp of angels, heavenly agents, a camp, the text says, and he calls the name of the place twin camps, Machanoim. Now, your helpful friendly art school transliterates the word so as not to shake your confidence, because it says he saw a camp and called the place twin camps, and surely if you read that in English, you're going to think, what's going on? Doesn't he know the difference between 1 and 2? So they write Machanaim instead of twin camps. But that's what it says, twin camps. How does it get to be twin camps? Okay, let's follow out the interpretation we had a moment ago. If there are two bands of angels, some internals and some externals, he's coming back to the land of Israel, hasn't reached it yet. Maybe the band of angels that he meets is the Israeli angels coming to greet him, and for a short period of time, there's an overlap. So because he meets a camp of angels, the name of the place is twin camps, because both camps are in front of him. Oh ho! So if I use the interpretation we gave before, you could explain this verse also. And then, since in both cases it turns out that the Israeli angels move first and the externals move second, with the ladder, the angels going up the ladder are the Israelis leaving him, and the angels coming down the ladder are the externals. Here he's coming back, he has the externals with him, and first the Israelis come to greet him. That's why there's two temporarily. So if that's the case, with the ladder, when the Israeli angels go up, until the externals come down, there's going to be a gap. Just like when you come back, there's an overlap. So when you're leaving, there's a gap. Guess what the text says over there? It said a God is standing over him. Why is God standing over him? Because there's a gap in the angels. That's why. The angels are supposed to be accompanying him. When there's no angels, God is there to step in. That fits very nicely, thank you. With one idea, you can explain 3 different pieces of verse in a reasonably cohesive way. That's not just being consistent. That's not the transvestite Macbeth. You're really explaining features of the text. On the other hand, Maimonides takes the text entirely differently. For him, the word angel here refers to prophets, which it does in other verses in the Tanakh. Prophets are called angels of Hashem. And the climbing the ladder is their increasing understanding of Hashem. And coming down is taking that new understanding that they achieved by drawing close to Hashem and using it to teach others. And as a general understanding, given the context of the culture of the Tanakh and all the rest, it's also a good explanation. So there you have a good explanation, 2 good explanations, and as I said before, unless it's announced that they're disagreeing with one another, there's no reason to say that they're disagreeing or excluding one another. They can both be true. The text can be meant to indicate both explanations, both interpretations, and even if they were to contradict one another, as I told you, it could be that the purpose of the text is to force you to consider the contradiction and to work with it and deal with it, and then in some other times of the place, you'll get a way of resolving the contradiction. And this raises another feature of interpretation, which is very, very difficult. Very difficult. People don't like it, they rebel against it, they make fun of it. Even though everybody knows you're not supposed to quote out of context. What's the context? Well, let's suppose you were commenting on an incident in the life of someone portrayed in a book, which is a novel about a person's life. And you're commenting on the meaning of that incident, its importance, the right and wrongs of what people did in the incident, and so forth and so on. And somebody says, don't quote out of context. What's the context? Isn't the context the whole book? It's an incident in his life. You're not going to understand what the book has to say about the incident unless you've read the whole book and you can put it into the total context. Now, the sad conclusion is that in the case of the Torah, the book is the 5 books of Moses. Whew, but it's so long, Rabbi, I'll never read all of that. Right, you probably won't, but then don't interpret it. Certainly don't interpret a word, a sentence, a paragraph, or a story out of context. That's not appropriate. Simple logic tells you it's not appropriate. So simply say, I read it, it was interesting, but I can't pass comment on it because I don't know enough. There is a phraseology in Jewish literature, Jewish literary study. Divrei Torah ani b'makom echad v'anashim b'makom acher. The words of Torah are impoverished in one place and rich in another place. It means that the Torah may treat a subject with very great brevity and a lot of information left out in one place. And if you look at the very same subject treated in another place, you'll see that it provides a lot more information, a lot more context. Maybe you have heard the phrase that God visits the sin of the fathers on the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren to the 4th generation, and preserves the kindness for thousands of generations. Okay, kindness, shmindness. Leave that aside. Well, what about visiting the sin on the descendants? What a terrible thing. How unjust, how primitive, how savage. These people are superstitious, and so forth and so on. Okay. Those words occur 4 times in the 5 books of Moses. 4 times. And they're identical. 2 are of one type and 2 of the other type. In particular, 2 of the times say what I told you, and the other 2 times say a little extra. A little extra is added in. It says, visits the sin of the fathers on the children and grandchildren of the 4th generation of those who hate me. Oh, of those who hate me. Not willy-nilly. Not independent of what the future generations do. If the future generations hate me, then the sins of the parents or grandparents will be visited upon them. And if not, not. Right. Does that make a difference? It better, otherwise have a cup of coffee because you're asleep. And preserving kindness for thousands of generations, the text says, for those who love me. There too, it's not willy-nilly, it's not blind, not free gifts. Now, how should you deal with this? In 2 places, the qualification is put in, and 2 places the qualification isn't. So if you are of the mindless academic orthodoxy, you say there were different authors and they had different philosophies and lived different periods of time, and one lived in Babylon, and one lived in Greece, and one lived in Assyria, and one was in the steppes of Russia, and who knows what kind of stories they make up. But the obviously correct answer is that the text doesn't say everything on every occasion. And the qualifications that are written in 2 of the places are the qualifications that express the concept, and in the other 2 places, it didn't bother to put in the qualifications because it's trusting that you'll read the whole book. And if you think that trust is naive, you're right. This is naive. The book was written for people who will read the whole book. If you don't read the whole book, it's not written for you. We have the rabbinic tradition as a phraseology. Kol mi she'rotzeh letos she'yavo v'yeteh. Person who wants to be misled, let him come and be misled. We're not fighting to, But at least the standards you would apply anywhere else, you'd have to read the whole book. If you did that, instantly you would know the answer. Now, if you say to me, but look, even though you've qualified it, and it's not willy-nilly, still it seems unfair that the sins of the father should be visited upon the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. There are at least 2 answers to that question. One answer on the surface is this. Sometimes people make mistakes because they don't know what the consequences will be. They're not aware of what's going to happen. They may have, false ideas about what the consequences will be. Think of politicians, the ones who aren't lying, the 1%. who are doing it in good faith, and it turns out differently. But if you continue it in the second and third generation, you're more guilty because you saw the consequences. You should know better. That's one way in which, indeed, you could add the sins of the prior and may be more strict with the later because they're more guilty. And the other is that according to certain Kabbalistic ideas, the continuation of a person's presence in the world is carried by his children and grandchildren, and to a certain extent, 4 generations carries it to I would say, enough of an extent that it should demand a kind of attention, and after that it peters out. So that would answer the question of why the sins of the first generation should be added to the later ones. But this, in terms of interpretation, you have to pay attention to parallel passages everywhere. I'll give you one more example, then I'm going to quit. I think it's chapter 40 in Isaiah, or it's right around there. Talk about context. The beginning of the chapter describes God as a shepherd for the Jewish people, how he cares for the Jewish people, and so on and so on. In the middle of the chapter, it says, to whom can you compare God? God is utterly incomparable to everything. God can't be understood or described at all. So the careful reader who hasn't fallen asleep between the beginning of the chapter and the middle of the chapter says, wait a minute, you yourself just told me that he's like a shepherd to the Jewish people. That's Isaiah's point. Because when you describe him, and this is rife in Jewish philosophy, what you're describing is what he does, not what he is. And when he says he's indescribable and incomparable, in the middle of the chapter, he means you have no idea what he is. And they're both true. But then you have to know that you can only understand the words that he's a shepherd for the Jewish people if you have the middle of the chapter on board also, so that you know you're not talking about what he is, you're only talking about what he does. Otherwise, they won't get it right. So this is one of the rules of interpretation. And this, I think this would apply across the board. Whether it's poetical, or whether it's a novel, or whether it's a history book, you're not going to get it unless you have the whole text in your grasp, so that you can then use the context to interpret what's being said. At any rate, I hope this at least encourages you that the idea that there's free play, and the idea that there's no standards, is simply a mistake.
You're very welcome.